Hi, this is Lauren May and Samantha Dunster. For our EDC1200 assignment, we have selected National Sorrow Day, also known as National Day of Healing.
We will be discussing how the event touches on notions of difference in relation to identities of and within the community and nation. We will conclude by discussing how we, as pre-service teachers, could address the issue in relation to identity, difference, dominance and diversity.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
Thousands of years ago, humans travelled by handmade boats and rafts, set out in great migrations in search of a new land to a continent we now know as Australia.
Over time, these coastal inhabitants explored inland, struggling with the climate and food sources. These Indigenous Australians continued to live off the land and adapt for thousands of years.
During an expedition around the Pacific Ocean in 1770, Lieutenant James Cook passed by Australia, then known as New Holland. Here he observed native people lighting fires with his telescope. Within a landing in Botany Bay, two Indigenous people held up spears to defend their land. This small event would be the start of much rivalry as the Indigenous people fought for their rights.
In Port Jackson, on January 26, 1788, the first fleet landed with convicts and livestock in order to begin a new colony. Unfortunately, diseases such as smallpox were also brought to the new land that caused many thousands of Indigenous deaths. Many Indigenous people died before even laying eyes on white man due to these new diseases.
Many of the new white settlers viewed the Indigenous natives as savages, and this ascribed collective identity was the notion for racial hate and awful actions towards these people. The national identity for Australia in its new formation was seen as the convict nation. Indigenous people were seen as the lowest of all, as this ascribed identity of the savages in the new colonies was ranked lower than that of the convicts themselves.
A prime example of the terrible way in which the white settlers treated Australian Aboriginals throughout history persisted even until recent decades to now. Under child welfare legislation and Aboriginal Protection Acts, it was allowed for Aboriginal children to be forcibly removed from their families and homes all throughout Australia under the so-called protection policies. These children were often taken to institutions, camps, missionaries, reform school, or adopted out to white European families.
It was said that the intent for these actions was to instill European work ethic and beliefs into the Australian Aboriginals. White settlers disliked the way Aboriginal parents raised their children because it was the binary opposite of white European parenting norms. Indigenous people were ascribed as lazy, irresponsible parents. Sadly, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were stolen from their families in childhood and still have never connected with their true family.
The emotional, physical and psychological trauma behind these events for the Aboriginal families of Australia has had a lasting effect. Most documentation was destroyed, resulting in those who were taken to be unaware of their birthday, place, names, true age and family to this day. Their true identity was destroyed. This has had a major effect on personal and cultural identity to the Indigenous Australians. The Aboriginal people who have endured this are now identified as the stolen generation.
In 1995 to 1996, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission conducted an inquiry into the forcible removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. The findings of the inquiry were reported in the National Inquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Their Families, the Bringing Them Home report, in May 1997.
The Australian government responded quickly to the Bring Them Home report, allocating a large sum of money in order to implement support of all kinds for those affected. 1998 marked the first year of National Sorry Day, an act of reconciliation which has now become an annual event. On the 13th of February 2008, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd did the apology to the stolen generations, as seen in the first part of this presentation. This was a huge event for Australia, which was televised on national and international television. National Sorry Day is celebrated now every year in towns, cities and schools with lots of cultural festivities and events, allowing Indigenous Australians to show pride in their rich traditional culture and proud national identity. I think it was necessary, but not enough is being done.
I think it puts black and white people at different ends of the scale.
It's good to see the gap closing between white Australians and Indigenous people. It gives an excuse for not living up to our standards.
It's good to see that their culture is being embraced and that we're invited to celebrate it too. Why should I have to apologise for what our ancestors did?
I think it's great to see the Indigenous Australians getting recognised for their hardships.
Yeah, I don't think it was enough. think the government were just trying to do a quick solve on the issues, but there's always going to be problems in the community forever.
I can't even begin to imagine how it would feel, your whole identity being taken away from you and stolen from your family like that.
Sorry. I don't really think the government put enough thought into how the Indigenous would feel about it. It sort of makes them look a little bit lower than us sometimes.
I didn't even really see a need for it. It kind of makes them feel sorry for themselves.
Yeah, I think Aunt Bessie would be proud, eh? Obviously, from these points of view in the community, some people have been able to close the gap in the zone of difference between the binary opposites, whereas some people still see a huge difference between self and other in relation to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
Next, we would like to address how these notions of difference derived from National Sorry Day could be used in our classrooms in the future as an educational experience for students. Immersing children in the different ways in which Indigenous Australians live in relation to what is important to the individual and their identity allows all students to experience and develop an understanding for the rich Indigenous culture. By students understanding the importance of National Sorry Day and the significance of learning about the proud Indigenous culture with a hands-on and practical approach, this allows younger and older students to connect to an understanding of the other. This event can help to form an understanding of the historical events and the importance of reconciliation. Sharing this event with students shows initiative of the Australian Government to say sorry and to form a brighter future for the Indigenous Australians. Talking about false stereotypes and how damaging they can be by discussing the right factual information in class, students will be better informed about these wrong stereotypes and perhaps will be better informed and won't be quick to form an ascribed identity.
I think we can develop children's sense of self by using these issues such as race and culture. If we address them, we can, help children understand that they're part of a unique racial group themselves, and we can develop a bit of an understanding and a tolerance, if I may, within these race cultures within our society. So we want to show children that everyone is different and their values and cultures are different, but each individual culture has their own things that are special in their own way. So these are individual values.
Each child has their own cultural background, and by illustrating this, we can make them aware that they all have their own special family traditions.
For each thing that's special to you, another person has a different thing that's just as special to them.
So, for example, Sam likes netball and I like lifesaving. For each factor brings a sense of belonging and personal value, somewhere where we can fit in and identify with others.
So we're going to use the National Sorry Day topic in class, and it will help to know the zone of difference in students.
It can also show that as a nation, we are building a stronger connection to the traditions of the Indigenous people.
We should teach students to appreciate and respect the history and diversity of the Indigenous people and the significant role they play in keeping their traditions alive today.
By showing the traditions, we are forming a more accepted view and closing the gap between the binary opposites of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, connecting to an awareness of other people's feelings and making them think of how it would make them feel and even others before their own time.
Yeah, we're going to also develop the feeling of security and that feeling of home. Obviously this is going to reflect off the whole notion of the stolen generations. They were taken from their home, and we're going to talk to kids a little bit about how this could make you feel. Okay, so perhaps we can incorporate things like Indigenous music into our classrooms. We could have our kids learn an Indigenous song approved by the Butchula elders of the region, of course. If we take this to parade and assemblies and present it to the other children in the class, it's, the kids at such an early age will be able to identify with that music and might find some enjoyment in it.
Especially from a young age, children are so enthusiastic about music, and it's just this one simple way they're able to connect with others through the means of song. I also believe that emphasising the positives of belonging to an Aboriginal culture, family connections, valued traditions, cultural aspects, dances, connections to land and food, perhaps students will be able to connect with one of their own connections to shared meanings with one that they share with their own family.
Definitely, so we might have our traditions. So for an Aboriginal family, a tradition might be playing some didgeridoo with the uncles. I'm not sure, but for me, a family tradition might be going to the park on a Saturday afternoon. So if kids can see that, they can help identify with each other that, there's special things within their cultures.
By making Indigenous part of the classroom as well, as we had previously stated, it enables them to feel more wanted, accepted, and makes them feel a more sense of home as well.
Yeah, so we're doing all this to help lessen this space in the zone of difference and therefore encouraging more acceptance between the children.
Ultimately, just a sense of place and home and connection to other kids as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Ultimately, by breaking down each difference and immersing children within diversities, by children being able to share their own special traditions with others, by exposing them to different aspects of what makes people different and allowing them to experience these things, is allowing them to narrow the zone of difference between self and other.
Definitely, and at such an early age we have the opportunities to mould the perceptions these kids have and steer them in a positive direction when it comes to discrimination.
Immersing children in the different ways in which Indigenous Australians live in relation to what is important to the individual and their identity allows all students to experience and develop an understanding for the rich Indigenous culture. By students understanding the importance of National Sorry Day and the significance of learning about the proud Indigenous culture with a hands-on and practical approach, this allows younger and older students to connect to an understanding of the other.
Some ideas we have for implementing this include gaining permission of the local Butchulla tribe to use particular songs in class to teach traditions of the Indigenous people.
Reading books written by the local Fraser Coast Currawinga Aboriginal Corporation project in 2006 by other primary school children in class.
Visiting the local Currawinga Indigenous Centre for students to explore the traditional Indigenous culture and to learn about stories, traditions, food and art.
In class, watch traditional dances and explain the origin and meaning of significant dance.
Organising excursions to explore local traditional Indigenous sites that are open to the public. It could include middens and sites of old fish traps.
Working in close guidance with the school's Indigenous Support Teaching Officer. Learning about the history of the Butchulla tribe in class and their stories of the Dreamtime and morals.
Talking about the totem animals of the tribes and how they play a major role in keeping the Indigenous people to sustain the species as they are not allowed to hunt, kill or eat their own family's animals.
And during National Reconciliation Week, encourage students to get involved with local community events and initiatives around the school.